In 1946, Heman Sweat, a black man, applied for admission to the University of Texas Law School. Texas state law restricted access to the university to whites, so Sweat was rejected. He took UT Law to court, so the university established a law school at Texas Southern University for black students. The case reached the Supreme Court, where they had to decide, did the state of Texas violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment by refusing to admit Sweat? In a unanimous decision, the court ruled yes, and that UT Law must admit Sweat under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. They added that the new school at Texas Southern was unequal to UT Law, and that the separation from the majority of law students harmed his ability to compete in the legal arena. In 1954, the NAACP challenged public school segregation in the state of Kansas. Thurgood Marshall argued on behalf of Linda Brown and a group of other black children who wanted to attend white schools. The Supreme Court ruled 9-0 that state laws establishing separate public schools for black and white children are unconstitutional. This overturns the 1896 case known as Plessy v. Ferguson, which previously established the doctrine of separate but equal. The Warren Court stated that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. Unfortunately, it provided no method for desegregating public schools and ordered the states to desegregate with all deliberate speed. Tired after a long day of work as a seamstress in a department store, Rosa Parks started a revolution by refusing to give up her seat to a white passenger. On segregated buses, seats near the front were given to white passengers. Parks was arrested and fined $10. Organized by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the leader of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the Montgomery Bus Boycott demanded that black passengers be treated with courtesy and that seating should become first come, first served. For 1 year, most of the buses in Montgomery ran nearly empty as African Americans walked and carpooled to work. Finally, the Supreme Court ordered the Alabama segregation laws unconstitutional. In 1957, the NAACP registered a group of 9 African American students to attend the all-white Little Rock Central High School. Orville Faubus, the governor of Arkansas, blocked them from attending the school with the Arkansas National Guard. After a couple of weeks, President Eisenhower ordered the 101st Airborne Division of the U.S. Army and federalized the Arkansas National Guard to escort the students into the school and allow them to attend. Those students became known as the Little Rock Nine. The most permanent legacy of the Eisenhower years was the passage of the Highway Act of 1956, which authorized the construction of 42,000 miles of interstate highways, linking all the nation's major cities. It had a major impact on the economy. It created jobs, promoted the truck industry, accelerated the growth of suburbs, and helped to limit sectionalism by creating a more homogeneous national culture. This was a serious blow to the railroad industry, which had been in decline since the 1920s. The interstate highway system also had a significant impact on the environment, as thousands of trees were cut down to make way for new highways to connect the major cities. Eisenhower's true reason for building the highway system was related to the Cold War. Roads could be used for emergency landings for the Air Force in times of war. The roads will be used to transport troops, supplies, and weapons. Overhead passes had to be a certain height on all interstate highways, so missiles could be transported underneath them. After 20 years out of the presidential office, Republicans had to reinvent their brand. Eisenhower proposed a new dynamic conservatism: be liberal with all things that deal with the people, but be conservative when dealing with the economy or government. This was known as modern republicanism. A moderate on social issues, Ike accepted most of the New Deal programs as a reality of modern life, and even extended some of them. Social Security was extended to 10 million more citizens, and the minimum wage was increased. He opposed a federal health care insurance program and federal aid to education. Ike was a fiscal conservative whose first priority was balancing the budget after years of deficit spending. Although his annual budgets were not always balanced, he came closer to curbing federal spending than any of his successors. In a speech, Secretary of State John Foster Dulles announced that the U.S. would protect its allies through the deterrent of massive retaliatory power. The policy announcement was a further evidence of Eisenhower's administration's decision to rely heavily on the nation's nuclear arsenal as the primary means of defense against communist aggression. The concept of massive retaliation is a military strategy that nuclear weapons can be used to prevent an all-out war because attack by an enemy of the U.S. would be countered with great nuclear response. This would deter any enemy from attacking because they knew the U.S. would respond with deadly force. The speech outlined the two main elements of Eisenhower and Dulles' foreign policy. First was the belief that the U.S. needed to roll back the communist sphere of influence. Second was that military and foreign aid spending had to be limited. A stronger reliance on nuclear weapons was more effective in threatening potential enemies and less expensive than having a large standing army. Some of the most serious Cold War challenges would come from Asia and Southeast Asia. Soon after his inauguration, Eisenhower kept his promise and visited the troops in Korea. Diplomacy, the threat of nuclear war, and the sudden death of Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union finally convinced China and the North Koreans to agree on an armistice or ceasefire in 1953. Korea would remain divided at the 38th parallel with a demilitarized zone separating the North from the South. However, no formal treaty was ever signed. Next came Indochina. Before World War II, Indochina was a French colony. During World War II, they lost it to Japan. After the war, they tried to reclaim it. The Communist Viet Minh, led by Ho Chi Minh, launched a guerrilla war against the French. Starting in 1950, this will be the next confrontation in the Cold War. The U.S. will send military aid to the French to prevent the spread of communism, while China and the Soviet Union will help Ho Chi Minh. In 1954, the French will lose at Dien Bien Phu and be forced to surrender. That year, all parties will meet in Switzerland and agree to the Geneva Accords. France agrees to give up Indochina, which is split up into the independent nations of Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. Vietnam is to be temporarily divided at the 17th parallel, which would also be demilitarized just like the 38th parallel in Korea, until a general election can be held. North Vietnam will be supported by the Soviet Union and China. South Vietnam will be supported by the U.S. Between 1955 and 1961, Eisenhower will send over $1 billion to prop up the anti-communist South. He will justify this with the domino theory. This is the idea that if one country in Southeast Asia falls to communism, it will spread throughout the region, as well as Australia and New Zealand. To prevent the fall of communism in South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, Secretary of State Dulles put together a regional defense pact called the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, or SEATO, agreeing to defend one another in the case of attack within the region. 8 nations will sign the pact in 1954: the U.S., Great Britain, France, Pakistan, Thailand, the Philippines, Australia, and New Zealand. A spontaneous national uprising that began 12 days before in Hungary is viciously crushed by Soviet tanks and troops on November 4, 1956. Thousands were killed and wounded, and nearly 250,000 Hungarians fled the country. Inaction on the part of the U.S. angered and frustrated many Hungarians. Voice of America radio broadcasts and speeches by President Dwight Eisenhower and Secretary of State John Foster Dulles had recently suggested that the U.S. supported the liberation of captive peoples in communist nations. Yet, as Soviet tanks bore down on the protesters, the U.S. did nothing beyond issuing public statements of sympathy for their plight. In the Middle East, the U.S. had the difficult balancing act of maintaining friendly ties with the oil-rich Arab states while at the same time supporting the new state of Israel. Israel was created in 1948 under the UN auspices, after a civil war in the British Mandate territory of Palestine left the land divided between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Israel's neighbors, including Egypt, had fought unsuccessfully to prevent the Jewish state from being formed. In 1953, the CIA played a major role in helping to overthrow a government in Iran that had tried to nationalize the holding of foreign oil companies. The overthrow of the elected government allowed for the return of Reza Pahlavi as Shah, or monarch of Iran. The Shah's return provided the West with favorable oil prices and made enormous purchases of American guns. During Eisenhower's presidency, the Suez Crisis posed a potential threat to peace between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Egyptian General Nasser asked the U.S. for funds to build the Aswan Dam on the Nile River. The U.S. refused because Egypt threatened Israel's security. Instead, the Soviet Union agreed to provide limited financing for the project. Seeking another source for funds, Nasser will precipitate an international crisis in July of 1956, known as the Suez Crisis. He will seize and nationalize the British and French-owned Suez Canal. The loss of the canal threatened Western Europe's supply line to Middle Eastern oil. In response, Britain, France, and Israel launched a surprise attack against Egypt and retook the canal. Furious at being kept in the dark, Eisenhower led a UN resolution condemning the invasion of Egypt, which forced the invading forces to withdraw. Britain and France would not play a major role in the world affairs again. On January 1, 1959, facing a popular revolution led by Fidel Castro, Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista flees Cuba for the Dominican Republic. Tens of thousands of Cubans, and thousands of Cuban Americans in the U.S., celebrated the end of the dictator's regime. The U.S. attitude towards the new revolutionary government soon changed from cautiously suspicious to downright hostile. After Castro nationalized American-owned property, allied himself with the Communist Party, and grew friendlier with the Soviet Union, the U.S. severed diplomatic and economic ties with Cuba and enacted a trade and travel embargo that remains in effect. An international diplomatic crisis erupted in May of 1960 when the Soviet Union shot down an American U-2 spy plane in Soviet airspace and captured its pilot Francis Gary Powers. Confronted with the evidence of his nation's espionage, President Eisenhower was forced to admit to the Soviets that the U.S. CIA had been flying spy missions over the Soviet Union for several years. The Soviets convicted Powers on espionage charges and sentenced him to 10 years in prison. However, after serving less than 2 years, he was released in exchange for a captured Soviet agent in the first ever U.S.-Soviet Union spy swap. The U-2 spy plane incident raised tensions between the U.S. and the Soviets during the Cold War. On January 17, 1961, Dwight Eisenhower ends his presidential term by warning the nation about the increasing power of the military-industrial complex. The military-industrial complex is an informal alliance between the nation's military and the defense industry that supplies it with weapons. His remarks, issued during a televised farewell address to the American people, were particularly significant since Ike had famously served the nation as military commander of the Allied forces during World War II. Eisenhower urged his successors to strike a balance between a strong national defense and diplomacy in dealing with the Soviet Union. He did not suggest arms reduction and in fact acknowledged the fact that the bomb was an effective deterrent to nuclear war. However, familiar with the idea that America's peacetime defense policy had changed drastically since his military career, Eisenhower expressed concerns about the growing influence of what he termed the military-industrial complex. Before and during the Second World War, American industries had successfully converted to defense production, as the crisis demanded, but out of the war, a permanent weapons industry emerged. This combination of a large military establishment and a large arms industry was new in American experience. Eisenhower cautioned that the federal government's collaboration with the alliance of military and industrial leaders, though necessary, was vulnerable to abuse of power. Ike then counseled American citizens to be vigilant in monitoring the military-industrial complex.